Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar about easy phone provisioning with EPM. My name is Olvida Crespo, and I'm the Product Marketing Manager for Open Source at Sangoma. Today we have Lauren Gates, PM for Open Source at Sangoma, who will take us through the EPM module. Good morning, Lauren.
Morning, Elvita. Thanks for the intro. And welcome everyone to Easy Phone Provisioning. We have a fair bit of content here, and we're just going to skip along right out of the gate here with our presentation. So here's our agenda for today. We'll do a quick overview of what EPM Endpoint Manager actually is, how it's installed, how it's licensed, a few of the basic concepts. We'll go into the administrator experience, how the EPM module is set up, introduction to the main global settings, how to add a brand, how to create a template in EPM, as well as the individual components in the EPM template process. We'll see how to set up some phone models with different models and the different line and soft key configurations. We'll discuss DPMA, the desktop phone module for Asterisk. We'll see how extension mapping works in EPM. And then hopefully, if there's time, we'll go into the user experience on UCP. So what is Endpoint Manager? EPM is a commercially licensed module for FreePBX and PBExact that will generate phone configuration files for numerous supported phone models. Once configured, you can take advantage of EPM. The main advantage of EPM is the new phone devices can be provisioned and updated in, excuse me, I have a window in front of my slide here. Let's just get rid of that. I guess I'll just have to live with it. Oh, I got rid of it, finally. Okay, the main advantage of EPM is that new phone devices can be provisioned, updates deployed with minimal effort. And that is really the strength of it. When we're talking about deploying phones via provisioning process, it's all centrally managed, and changes, updates, and deployments are essentially instantaneous once the initial configuration is done. How do you install Endpoint Manager? It is installed as all other FreePBX and PBExact modules are. You browse to admin updates, click the module updates tab, check online, and from the resulting list, you can install or update any modules you want, including Endpoint Manager. How does EPM licensing work? EPM is free to use for provisioning all Sangoma devices. All other supported devices require a purchase license. You can get additional details at portal.sangoma.com in the portal store. Note, this is not the primary focus of this presentation, but the phone apps module is licensed separately. It is also free to use for Sangoma devices and also paid for other non-Sangoma devices. So the basics, EPM uses templates to provision groups of similarly configured devices. A single template can configure multiple different models and phones from a single manufacturer. All the devices provisioned using the template will be configured similarly using the same firmware bundle. You will commonly have several templates if you're using Endpoint Manager. You may have a need to configure devices differently between offices in different geographical locations, or you may wish to have your template separated by employee or job, have the phones provisioned separately depending on the employee's duties. So administrators' phones are configured differently than management, that sort of thing, or some sort of combination between the two. Flexibility is there regardless of how you want to lay things out. More is not better. Managing a system with many templates means more work for you as the administrator. Generally, you want to group your devices in manageable quantities. If each of your users have different BLF button layout needs or time zone, you do not need to create a separate template for each of those cases. There are features within Endpoint Manager to allow users or administrators to make changes to button layout, to user time zone within the same template. Also consider having a template for testing, particularly for firmware testing or for using advanced features such as base file editing. So you may select one or two or a small number of devices, have them provisioned from the testing template from which you can roll out new features or new configurations. Supported devices. EPM supports all Sangoma Digium Series S, D, and P-Series and DEC phones. The only Sangoma devices that are not supported in Endpoint Manager are the old AOL A-Series phones. There are hundreds of current and legacy devices from a range of manufacturers also supported. Some of these devices are EPM certified, meaning there was coordination from the device manufacturer when we did the initial coding and testing. There are also uncertified devices in the list of supported devices, which have basic config only. In addition to traditional IP desk phone devices, EPM has provisioning support for other things, such as DECT cordless phones, for gateways, paging devices, specialty door phones, conference phones, etc. The official list of EPM supported devices can be found in the FreePBX wiki by searching at wiki.freepbx.org for EPM supported. The URL is here as well. So let's do a quick overview of what the administrator sees when they're using Endpoint Manager. As part of the initial setup before configuring any phones, the administrator will need to set up for the first time. You need to browse to Settings, Endpoint Manager, and note when you get there that there is a collapsible menu on the right side of the screen that may or may not be collapsed by default, depending on your system config. You can expand that main menu, and from there you choose Global Settings. The EPM Global Settings is where you set some system defaults for various attributes that are used for all system templates. So of the various different fields that are available here, the most important ones are the internal and external address. Endpoint Manager allows administrators to specify separate internal and external addresses. These can be host names, IP addresses, FQDN, that sort of thing. If you're using a different address to reach your PBX from internal users versus external users, you can configure them here. If you're using a VPN that is not configured internally on the PBX in the system admin, you could also use that address in one of these two slots. Note that these are defaults, but we can deviate from these in the individual templates. Immediately below the address fields, we have the ports and protocols summarized here. So whatever provisioning protocols you have enabled in system admin, they will be listed here with their corresponding port configuration. In addition, you will also see what firewall zone each of these services is zoned to in the FreePBX firewall. So at a glance, we can tell which protocols are enabled, what ports are in use, and what zones they have in the firewall. So we can quickly tell, depending on the use case or where our phone is located, which provisioning protocol to use and how to use it. Immediately below the ports, there's also a note here indicating whether HTTP or HTTPS provisioning authentication is enabled or disabled. And if it's enabled, it will show you what the username and password are. So you would use those to strings in conjunction with the protocol and the port for generating the provisioning URL in cases where you are configuring phones via Apache. You'll see a phone admin password that should be a unique random string, not easily guessable. You don't want people logging into your phones as an administrator and mucking about with settings if they're not authorized. You will see an option there to use DPMA. That is the desktop phone module for Asterisk. That is how current Sangoma phones are provisioned. You will want DPMA enabled if you're using Sangoma P-Series phones or select D-Series phones. You will note that there are some settings here for extension IP mapping or extension mapping phone status. If you want to see the current status and IPs of phones in the extension mapping page in Endpoint Manager, you can enable that. If you find that that page generates very slowly, disabling one or the other or both of these settings can speed up that process. And the very last one at the bottom, admins UCP for all. Generally, you want that enabled. That allows you as an administrator logged into the admin GUI to be able to edit the phone button layout as if you were a user in the same way that the user sees when they log into UCP. On first install, only the Sangoma brand is enabled in EPM. If the brand for your device is not currently enabled, you can add it from the EPM main menu on the right. Deleting all of the templates associated with a specific brand will disable it. You would then need to re-add it again if you need it. When you first enable a brand in Endpoint Manager, a new template form is launched. You will need to enter the template name as a minimum so that you can save it, but you can also add all the other details to the template as you create it. So let's walk through creating a new EPM template. So I'm going to create a new template for the Sangoma P-Series phone. So I browse the Sangoma brand, I click the P-Series phone option, and I click a button to create new template. When the template form opens, you will see a series of tabs horizontally across the top, starting on the left with the General tab. So here on the General tab, you have the option of setting this template to be the default for internal or external templates. These are used in cases where you're using hot desking to provision the phone. You can choose to set the destination address that is internal and external are pre-populated based on the settings in global settings. And importantly, if neither internal nor the external address are correct for this particular template, there is an option to enter a custom address. You have a preferred PJ-SIP transport. So by default in FreePBX or PBExact, when you create a PJ-SIP extension, it allows registrations using any of the SIP transports enabled on the system. So you may have UDP, TCP, and or TLS. From here, you can choose which of those is preferred if multiple are selected. You must set the provisioning server protocol, whether you're provisioning with HTTP or HTTPS. In this case, we will be provisioning with DHCP, so the selection here is unimportant. But if you were using other phones, other Sangoma devices off this same template that might use provisioning server protocol, you would set that here. Again, you can set the provisioning server address to either the internal or external preset, and there's an option to add a custom address for provisioning. Phone apps protocol, likewise, is also settable in the same way as the provisioning server protocol. Next tab over is the regional tab. This is where localization parameters are set for the users using this template. The time zone is the default. Individual users are free to set their own time zone from the default if they wish. They can do that in UCP, or you as an administrator can edit the UCP settings in extension mapping. Time server is settable here. It pre-populates with a public time server as shown, but if you want to set the time from the PBX, you can enter the PBX address here for that as well. Options tab is where the bulk of the phone configuration is done. There are many options on this tab, far too many to go over in detail, and the screen cap only shows the first few. I'll just highlight some of the more important ones. You can set a background image. So if any of your phones that support wallpapers, you can upload an image using the EPM upload image feature, and then select it here in the template. The image will automatically be sized appropriately for the phone you're provisioning and uploaded as wallpaper. You can choose the line label format, whether you want the extension name, the extension number, or both to be shown for BLF buttons. Dial patterns is important. The default is fairly permissive, but it may be necessary on occasion or some edge cases to allow other dial sequences from the phone. So if you have an unusual feature code or some international calling, you may need to adjust dial patterns to allow other digit sequences to be dialed. You can control screen brightness, contrast, dimming, the timeouts, and all those are settable on the options screen. You can choose the default ringtone. There are volume settings for the handset, speaker, headset volumes. All of those are settable as default, and then the user overrides those as they wish when they actually use the phone. In the options tab, you control whether the phone will show missed call notifications, and also an option for call completed elsewhere. So for phones that are rung as part of a group, you can suppress the missed call notification on all the devices that didn't answer the call when one of the group did answer the call. There's also Wi-Fi settings settable here at the bottom of the options tab. Many other options, as I said, they're detailed in the wiki as well as in the GUI with individual tooltips. Next tab over is redundancy. If you have a PBX set up in a hot spare, warm spare arrangement, here is where you set the backup destination. So if SIP registration fails on the primary PBX, then it uses this address here to attempt a registration on the backup server. There is also outbound proxy and proxy port are settable here if your SIP environment requires those. VLAN tab is where you specify VLANs if you're on a network that's using them. For the P-Series phones, both LLDP and manual are supported for VLANs. In addition, the 802.1x authentication settings are settable here as well for those that need them. And the tasks have some administrative options as far as the template goes. You can remove, delete the template. You can export the template to a CSV file, which can then be used to import it elsewhere. And you can also duplicate this template under a new name so that you can make some minor changes to it based on the initial layout that's already done here. That being the case, you can then hit apply to save the template, and when you do that, one new tab shows up second from the left, the models tab. As an administrator, you must enable all models that you need to provision. Only models that are enabled can be provisioned. So the default BLF button and app layout for each model is all configurable from here. So at a glance, I can see that I've enabled the models D50, D65, D80, and all the P phones, as well as an expansion module, PM200. All other models are currently disabled, none of those. So I would not be able to provision a D70 using this template until I actually click on that, enable it, and make some configuration changes. So let's take a quick look at what you see if we click on one of these models. We'll choose the P330 for this. So if I click on the model P330, the first thing we see on the resulting screen is a toggle. We can choose to define the line keys or the horizontal soft keys. The line keys in this context are the vertical buttons to the left and right of the LCD display on the phone. These can be used for VLF buttons or speed dials, or optionally for phone apps. You can also use, define DTMF buttons here as well if you need to play DTMF tones while you're on a call. The horizontal soft keys are the 4 buttons immediately below the LCD display on the P330. These are used exclusively for phone apps. So let's see what the line keys look like. First thing you'll note is that the line key 1 is grayed out. That's unconfigurable. And the reason for that is that all P-Series phones have the first line key dedicated for the SIP account registration. So a single SIP account will disable line 1. If I had multiple accounts, such as two SIP registrations, then line key 2 would also be unusable for anything other than line key for account 2. From there, we can set BLFs and speed dials to whatever we want. It's easy enough to set a BLF. You put in the label and the value for the individual extensions you want to monitor. You can do the same thing for speed dial, whatever labels you want, freeform, and what number you want to dial when that button is pressed. There are also options to add different phone apps. So if you want to add a phone app to one of the vertical buttons, you don't need to, because all apps are accessible from one of the horizontal soft keys. But if you want it on one of the vertical buttons, that is an option as well. You can just select it from the drop-down menu and add a label. On the horizontal soft keys, they are reserved exclusively for phone apps. As I said, these button assignments are context sensitive, so depending on the state the phone is in, will determine what buttons are displayed and how they're configured. So in the idle phone state, we can see the default config. By default, the missed calls app shows up on the left-hand side, followed by context and status. Since there are more than 4 apps here, the remaining apps would scroll off onto page 2, 3, depending on how many apps you have configured. All of those are configurable here as an administrator. If you do not want to provide a contacts app for your users, you can disable that here, or you can move it off to page 2 and replace it with something that's more useful for your users. You have flexibility here of how you want those buttons defined when the phone is idle. There are similar settings for hold, incoming, connected, dial, etc. Here is what we see when the phone is connected. So while the call is currently in progress on a phone, then you can see the leftmost button is conference button, followed by contacts or end call. You'll see the record toggle button shows up further on. If you wanted to rearrange things such that the record toggle shows up on the first page, you're free to do that here. Or if you find your users need to park more frequently than conference, you might choose to put that on the first page and place the conference on the second page. Let's talk about DPMA. So all the current desktop Sangoma desk phones use the desktop phone module for asterisk or DPMA. This is a powerful protocol that piggybacks the asterisk SIP transports that are already defined on the system. And it allows you to also use those transports to download phone provisioning files using SIP signaling ports, and to maintain two-way communication between the phone and the PBX. Once the initial DPMA config is done, phones are securely provisioned in seconds with nothing more than just the PIN, with no need to expose any additional protocols to potentially untrusted traffic. So from the main EPM menu, which is collapsed on the right, we expand that and select DPMA Management. That brings up the screen we see here on the right of the slide. The important thing to take here is to make sure that the global PIN is a unique, unguessable number. It is this PIN that you would use to provision a phone. It's that you're challenged for when you're setting up a phone for the first time. If your PBX is also located on the same subnet as any DPMA phones, you may wish to enable and configure MDNS with the settings that follow. This would allow your phone to automatically discover the phone when it boots, and it will prompt the user if they wish to connect to any PBXs that it discovers on the LAN. There's an option here also to select the default EPM template to use when provisioning a phone via DPMA for the first time. And obviously, any changes you make to this page, you submit the page with the Save Settings button. So once those settings have been done, with the Sangoma P-Series phone in a factory default condition, when it boots for the first time, you will see the option to enter a Sangoma configuration server. If you select that, you will see the screen cap on the upper right. You will have an option to enter the PBX address, which need not be anything more complex than just an IP address. Choose the SIP transport port that is set on the server. Default is 5060. And whatever protocol you wish to use to provision the phone for the first time. The phone will then reboot, and once booted, the phone will prompt for the global configuration password. This is the DPMA PIN and that I noted previously on the DPMA management page in the previous slide. Enter that PIN, and assuming the PIN challenge is correct, you will be presented with a list of all extensions on the system. You need only select from that list, press enter, the phone will provision itself, boot, and register using that one extension. So with using this technique, you need nothing more than the DPMA PIN. And if you enable zero-touch provisioning, or if you are on a LAN that has a DHCP option 66 set, you don't even need to enter the server of the PBX. It will discover that automatically using the using either DHCP option or the zero-touch provisioning server. If you want to enable that for your phone, you browse to portal.sangoma.com and configure the phone to get the PBX configuration details directly from the portal. If you're not using a DPMA phone, then you will want to familiarize yourself with the extension mapping screen. So the day-to-day config of Endpoint Manager is done on extension mapping. You access this from the EPM menu, the main menu, and choose extension mapping. It will load up a page, will indicate all of the settings, all of the devices that are currently configured in Endpoint Manager, and allow you to add new ones. Deployed phones are mapped by associating a previously created extension on the PBX to the MAC address for the phone. You'll note that any entries that show up on this page may be in yellow or green, as the example illustrates. So all of the configurations for the green devices indicate that they are built and up to date. The yellow one indicates that I've made changes to either the template or to the phone device and have not rebuilt the configuration files. So I'll need to do that before I force a provision on that device in order to ensure that it gets up-to-date configuration. And we already talked about DPMA in the previous set of slides. So let's see what happens when we examine an extension mapping in detail. Each individual mapping on the screen has a series of icons on the rightmost column. From here, you can use the little pencil button to edit it, edit the extension mapping. The UCP BLF buttons here, you can use that little slider icon to edit the buttons. This is the same configuration options that the user sees when they log into UCP. As an administrator, you can also override the BLF and horizontal soft key defaults of the template with using personalized settings for this one specific device. There are also buttons to force the phone to config and force the phone to reboot if the phone is currently registered. To create a new mapping, there is a button that says Add Extension. You click that, it will open up a new option in white with a series of fields that you fill out. You select the extension from the drop-down menu. If this is the first account for the phone, you would use the default account 1. If you're configuring a single device with multiple SIP registrations, you do that by setting each to a different account number. So if I wanted 2 registrations, I would have 2 entries in the extension mapping, one using account 1, one using account 2, and both using the same MAC address. You select the previously created EPM template from the drop-down menu that is on the upper right here in the screen cap. You would enter the model number of the phone from the drop-down menu, and as I mentioned before, only phone models that have specifically been enabled for the template can be provisioned using this template. So I have to ensure if I'm provisioning the P330, which I am, that that has previously been enabled for that template. Finally, I populate the MAC address using the MAC address field and submit the page. Once a mapping has been created, we can edit it using the pencil icon, and this is an example of what we would see if we're editing an extension mapping in EPM. From here, you can update any of the previously entered data other than the extension number, as well as configure the device with any expansion modules if you have them. So in this specific example, you'll note that I have a P330. I've also attached a single expansion module to it and indicated that in the appropriate slot. If you have a VPN set up and configured in System Admin, here is where you would enable VPN for the phone. So selecting the appropriate VPN client that's already been configured previously. When you save this configuration and force your phone to reprovision, it will configure itself automatically to register first as a VPN client to the PBX and then use the private VPN IP for all communications to the PBX from that point. User experience. So as a user, you're free to make changes to the default settings, to some of the default settings in that the administrator sets in the template. So if the user logs into the user control panel using the normal method that they would use to do so, if they've been granted permission to see the device management widget, they will have, or they can add the device management widget to the UCP desktop. It will look similarly to what I have shown here. And there's a little gear icon in the upper right of the desktop. When the user clicks that, they will see a familiar looking screen. It looks very similar to what the administrator sees when they're setting up the models in the EPM template. So you'll see that the user will have the option of toggling either the line keys or the horizontal soft keys. The line keys by default will pull all of the settings from whatever the administrator has set for the template, similarly for the horizontal soft keys, and the user is free to change whatever they want here. If they want to remove or rearrange, add, subtract, they are free to do so completely to set up their own device in whatever way they want. Not shown here as part of the screen cap, but also an option at this point is to revert their settings to the template default. So if the user gets into a state where they mess things up and wish that they had not made any changes or want to start over, they can revert the settings to their defaults, and from there either continue to use the phone using default settings or rearrange buttons as they wish. We didn't talk about any of the more advanced features in Endpoint Manager. It's sort of beyond the scope of a short webinar, but they are described in the wiki as shown in the I'm sorry, that's the wrong link for the wiki. My apologies. If you browse to wiki.sangoma.com or wiki.freepbx.org and search for EPM or Endpoint Manager, you'll find a wiki page, a user guide, which goes in great depth about all of the additional features for Endpoint Manager. Notably, advanced features such as the base file editor. So in the template exposes lots of individual parameters that the administrator can control, but typically phones have many more orders of magnitude, more features than what are directly settable in the Endpoint Manager template. And so using the base file editor, you can go into the template base files and make changes in a way that are permanently attached to the template, but without a specific parameter exposed in the template GUI. And that can be very useful for some edge cases or for using features on uncertified devices that are not exposed in the template. You also note that in the wiki there describes the ability to use variables when setting BLF buttons or when setting base file edits, so that you can automatically populate the label, the BLF button label or the dial string with the extension number of the logged in user or many of other variables. Let me see here. If you have a use for any of those types of features, you'll note my email address here. You're certainly free to contact me with specific questions about that sort of thing. Likewise, you can go on the FreePBX community forum and ask questions to the experts there and get some provisioning tips for phones. And that otherwise brings the presentation to a close. I got through the material a little faster than expected. So let me see if I can figure out how to pull up the questions. If there's any questions, you please feel free to enter them now. I am not seeing. Okay, so I see a few questions here. Let me resize my window so I can see what I'm reading. So we have a question about Daniel. It appears to be a support question about losing configuration, about line key configuration. I'm not sure specifically what might cause that, but I should have mentioned that as a commercial module, if you're paying for the module, you can get commercial module support directly from Sangoma support. And if you have a Sangoma device, you can open a ticket for the phone and ask questions specifically about provisioning. So that might be probably an option for you from this point rather than in the webinar format. Open a support ticket, or again, you can go to the FreePBX community forum and ask there as well. A question looks like a question from Arkwell. I'm probably mispronouncing your name. P-Series Phones. I don't see a P370 option. Any ideas? I suspect you're using an out-of-date version of Endpoint Manager. if you're on FreePBX or PBExact 15 or up, you should see the P370 option and the PM200 expansion modules on any current version of the module. I'm pretty sure you're looking at an older version of the module. Trevor is asking if we can use the PBX as an NTP server, and I did gloss over that very early on in the presentation. As part of the template setup on the regional tab, you can specify the address for the NTP server. It defaults to some public FQDN, but you are free to change that to the address or IP host name, whatever, of the PBX. And as long as there is a route from the phone to that address, then you can get the time that way. If you're using the FreePBX distro or PBExact, NTP service is up and running by default on the PBX. Arkwell is coming back again using FreePBX 15. I don't know the current version of Endpoint Manager, so I can't comment whether that is the current version or not. But you can see my email address in front of me here. Send me a note, Arkwell, and we'll get you pointed in the right direction. I see no more questions. We'll keep things open for another minute or so. Does anyone else have any information about Endpoint Manager specifically, or maybe FreePBX more generally, PBExact, asterisk DPMA phones? I do my best to answer whatever people have on their minds in the few minutes remaining to us here. Jay says, thank you, Jason. Okay, no more questions trickling in here, so I think we'll cut things off there then. Thank you very much for your attendance, your interest in FreePBX and PBExact. I hope the foregoing was useful. Again, one of my many tasks in the FreePBX world is community manager. So if you have any thoughts on the webinar or on FreePBX or open source generally, feel free to drop me a note via email or ping me on the community forums, and we can continue a conversation after this. Thanks all.
Thank you.